Welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Jeff Nugent, and you're on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn group, Ask the Expert. I've got a great episode today, a really fun one, actually. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and I think a lot of people's favorite places in the world that we're going to talk about today. And I have a great friend of mine to talk about the differences in Italy and a focus on Italy when you're talking about global employer of record and global employment. I've got Matteo Bianchini, and he's here to talk about Italy and the complexities, the interesting things when employing workers in that wonderful place of Italy. Especially this time of year, it's summertime. North Americans are flocking to Italy. We love the food, the culture, everything, my friend. And so thank you so much for being here. And for the viewers, Matteo has over 20 years of experience in the staffing, contingent, and employment worlds, and 10 plus years specifically in the employer of record world as well. I got to know him when we worked together at People 2.0, and we would always have amazing conversations. So I thought, hey, when we have a focus on Italy, Matteo is the man. So thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff, for the invitation, for letting me be here.
And mispronouncing your name so many times. But anyways, that's all fun and games. Okay, so, when we were working together, Italy was always an interesting place. And so there's differences in culture, how people work, but there's also very different employment laws and legislative issues and things that come into play when we're talking about employing people in your country. So can you kind of highlight why is Italy so special? One, I think it's special because everything we just talked about and why we flock there as tourists, but there's also that very interesting and complex situation when it comes to employing people in Italy. Can you highlight some of the differences and why is it so special?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jeff. So the labor law in Italy is rather complex. Yeah, so we are not that unique, to be completely fair with you. France, for example, has got a very similar, complex system, as well as Spain, partially Portugal.
Germany. When you kind of get into the Central Europe, there's a lot of different, yeah.
Exactly.
So I know when we used to work together, it would be interesting when you'd say, hey, I have someone that I want to employ at this salary or this hourly rate. And then you'd say, can you price this for me, what the overhead would be? And you'd be surprised. And so what are some of the interesting differences between, say, I know we're focusing on Italy, but you can kind of parlay that into some other European areas. What are some of the interesting things that go into that would surprise North Americans? Because educating people on the differences also helps make everybody a little bit more comfortable with the process.
So certainly, no, absolutely, Jeff. So often when I talk to American prospects or clients, and they talk about the gross salary, for example, right? So let's say I want to offer 100K annual gross salary to an employee in Italy, right? And then when actually they see how much they're going to cost them, they always question what's going on there, and so on and so on. So Italy, unfortunately, is actually the number 2, I think, after France, but one of the countries where the difference between how much an employee costs, right, to the company versus how much the employee pockets at the end of the month, the difference is huge. Just to give you an example, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to offer 100K annual gross, okay, to the employee, the cost to company is roughly 140,000. So there is a 40% employer's cost. And the employee, unless this person, enjoys a special tax regime, like regime impatriati, if you want, we can also talk about this.
Yeah.
It pockets around 65,000. So imagine the huge difference between 140,000 and 65,000, right? So that's usually something that makes difficult, to sell our solutions, if you want, right, to the Americans that are interested in hiring someone. On the
Yeah,
other hand,
and that's often like, and I would just simplify it as, okay, here's the pay rate. When you look at this government overhead,
yeah,
that's amortized into that, let's call it 43% markup. That's government overhead, and it's categorized in what goes to the employee, which is stuff like vacation pay, severance termination, that's amortized into that rate. Sick leave in some cases, legislative sick leave that you can line item into that. And then there's what's paid to the government. So the payroll taxes, pension plan, things that are line item that are just taxes that goes to the government. So when you outline it and make it a little bit more transparent, then it allows customers to digest it, although you often don't like it. And then when you say on 100,000 gross salary, the worker's only getting 63 of it, it means between income tax and their side of the payroll deductions and remittances, there's another 40 kind of percentage, rough math, that is coming off their paycheck too. So, when you look at it in totality, there's a lot that needs to either be amortized and paid to the worker for vacation, etc. And then there's lots that goes to the government. So it just clarifies it. And unfortunately, it kind of is what it is.
absolutely, Jeff. But on the other hand, most of the things that in the US, for example, would be considered benefit, right, and offered on top of the package, they're already standards, right? So they're already included in the employer's cost. You mentioned, pension, for example, is already there. Maternity, assistance is already there. Unemployment benefits and therefore unemployment contributions is already there. So, it's just a completely different point of view, right? But certainly, it is costly, or might appear costly to employ someone in Italy. Also, and that is the difference between, the service level that we provide and the also the guidance that we provide versus, and other global providers.
Yeah.
Nobody will tell you that, a big part of these 40% employers' cost, or actually part of it, is something that is called TFR, so end of service allowance, which is nothing else than an extra salary given to the employee anyway, right?
Yeah.
So in fact, the employer's cost is not really 40%, it's around 31-32% overall, right? But
Yeah.
you're still, the employer, you're still obliged by law to accrue part of that amount, okay, part of the salary,
Yeah.
that will be given to the employee only at the end of the assignment or the end of the employment relationship. And again, here history plays a huge role, Jeff. Why was that? Why is that? Because back then they wanted to guarantee an extra treasure at the end of the working history of an employee, right? Okay.
So the other thing that's very interesting too is, on a global basis, a lot of the providers, and there's a lot of discussion around it being a professional employer or PEO service, which is interesting because the only jurisdiction in the world that actually has professional employer or PEO legislation is in the US. And so the US has, specific legislation around a third party employing workers or co-employing workers on behalf of other companies and managing their benefits and other things like that. And so when we look on the global employment models, you're hearing more and more about EOR, or employer of record. but you're also seeing in the same breath and or the providers providing EOR marketing it as PEO services. So can you clarify maybe some of either the differences or the similarities within those two models?
Absolutely, Jeff. You're absolutely right. So, US is the only country where this is probably regulated, right? So, and the word PEO has a sense, has a meaning, right? The industry, the UR industry, the employer record industry, tends to often confuse these two terms, PEO and EOR. Absolutely agree. Although I believe actually that in the Netherlands recently there was new legislation which kind of regulated what is probably similar to PO in the US, but I'm not an expert in the Dutch jurisdiction. So, but anyway, the reason why, for example, right? So we wanted to call it the company PO Italy is because we wanted to get as closer as possible to the US legislation, where not only we would offer staffing solution like employer record, so you employ somebody on behalf of another company, but also to offer other type of solutions like benefit administration and so on and so on, that are complete, if you want, the offering, the labor offering to our clients. But I completely agree with you. PEO is not EOR, and vice versa.
Yeah. So that actually leads into an interesting conversation that we've had many times and often has created a massive amount of confusion in the EOR market. And this is employing permanent type workers on behalf of another employer, which is kind of PEO-like, right? Where it's a salaried worker that is going to be working primarily just for that company that you're employing them on behalf of that company in that jurisdiction, and they're getting benefits and things like that. And then employer of record for contingent or contract and temporary labor and or workers and contractors. And so, there's very much differences between the two. And quite honestly, there's legislation and legalities in employing them. And often it's very important for employers and people that are using employer of record to know the difference and understand if their provider can actually deal with contract and temporary workers in that jurisdiction versus trying to make a contractor look like an employee for the purposes of structuring it because they don't have certain requirements that make them legally able to employ contract workers in that jurisdiction. Can you help me demystify, let's call it, the difference between those two types of services?
Absolutely, Jeff. So, when we talk about contractors, we need to clarify what we are talking about, right? So, because I know, for example, the term contractors in the US has a certain meaning, in the UK has a different meaning, perhaps in a third country, it means something completely different. So, and I don't want to today probably talk about the difficulties also in establishing whether a contractor is somebody that should have a company, so considered as a pure independent contractor versus rather an employee. Let's simply talk about the employer record applied to people that are assigned to short-term work, so short-term assignments versus people that are hired on a permanent basis, right? And that was the argument we discussed many times, right, when we were back at Capital, back at People 2.0. So the what we used to call CUR and PUR, so contractor EOR and permanent EOR, right? Or temp and perm staffing employees, right? So they are basically under the same legislation, right? And that happens, by the way, in different parts of Europe. Now let's actually focus on Italy, right? So in Italy, basically, they are both the same category of employees. So they are employees that they are hired by a staffing agency, and they are working for a third party, right? For a client, right?
Yeah.
However, actually, there are two different licenses that are one on the other mode. So meaning that there is a license if you want to work with temp staffing, and there is a license if you want to work with the perm staffing. Yeah. So also the legislation actually requires different for example, different number of internal staff if you want to, run a business for temp and different payroll software and things like that. But long story short, then if you want to hire a worker on a permanent basis and you want to lease this worker on a permanent basis, the legislation in Italy call it staff leasing. So when we actually talk about staff leasing in Italy, means permanent basis. Whereas instead we are actually talking about employing contractors, or actually workers on a temporary basis. Yeah, that is called most general somministrazione, so leasing of employees, if it makes sense.
Yeah, and that's often the general term is labor leasing or licensing for the temporary contract worker. And that's a regime that's happening across the globe. Like even in Canada, there's recent legislation that's come out that government said you need to be licensed to be a staffing and a recruiter, but mainly it's to employ the contract and temporary workers properly as well. So it's interesting. And so when you're looking at the employer of record model, especially in Europe, the licensing regimes are important. You have companies that say they're an employer of record and they don't have the licensing to do contract or temporary workers. And so you should be aware of that, because in a lot of legislation, sometimes the end employer is on the hook for the liability if it's not done right. And also potentially liable if they're using unlicensed vendors to provide EOR services on their behalf. So, knowing the difference, if you're trying to employ or have someone employ on your behalf more of a salaried or a permanent worker, the EOR community can do that. And then there's, hey, I have a contract or a temp worker in that jurisdiction or a freelancer to employ. You should be asking a little bit more, doing a little bit more due diligence, asking a few more questions around licensing capability. One of the red flags I always heard from employers of record was, well, can we turn that hourly rate into a salary, a monthly salary? That usually is a quick red flag that that employer of record does not have the licensing or the knowledge or the capability to employ contract workers in that jurisdiction. So I know we've had these discussions many, many times, but it's good to help demystify that. And it's okay. Just know what you're buying in EOR services.
Absolutely, Jeff. I mean, this is actually something that I'm really, really passionate about. Yeah. So when I created PO Italy, the goal was actually to create something that is sustainable and something that would protect both employees and clients. Now, the license topic is something that the users, so basically the clients that are using your solution, should be aware of, right? For many years, EOR providers used to say, oh, it's a gray area, really. Licensing is not really needed or necessary. This is not true. Not only because the law is pretty clear about this, right? So what does the law say? The law says that if you do employ somebody on behalf of someone else, or actually if you do employ somebody and then you send this person to work, virtually send somebody to work for another client, that is very much labor leasing. And that is what UR is about. So the gray area is more, if you ask me, on the fiscal aspect of it, right? Shall the client not residing in the country really contributing in the system with corporate tax? That is another topic probably for another call, right? Because very often we have seen an abuse of UR solutions to bypass the law from that point of view, right?
Yeah.
But going back to the specific labor law topic, now when you hire someone and you lease to someone else, then this company must have the license. Now, many clients, some of the clients or prospect that I talked to when I was trying to explain how important that the thing is, they mentioned, oh, whatever, but these are the platform, and I don't want to name them, right? But
Yeah.
these are the platform told me, oh, don't worry, we look after everything. And the prospect I was talking to was under the impression that, oh, if they're doing something wrong, too bad for them. I'm okay because I signed an agreement. Well, that is not the case, unfortunately. Again, in Italy as well as in other countries, just give an example, we have the AUG, similar in Germany, but it's the same in France, in Romania, in Portugal, in Spain, and so on and so on. The law says if you do use the service from a provider that is not licensed, you are equally guilty of breaking the law. Exactly the same. In fact, actually, also the users, so the clients, the end client, they can face a fine for up to 80,000 euros, 80, okay? Plus the obligation to hire the person directly, and therefore it means the obligation of establishing an entity and pay corporate tax anyway. So using a provider that doesn't have a license in Italy should be very concerning for the end clients. And that's something that, really gets me patient, right? So, because, I feel sorry for clients that they have no idea of those kind of implications.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of marketing right now in the global EOR space because the pandemic really accelerated the use of remote workers and a global workforce and a global talent pool. So now you can find someone in Italy, someone in Germany, someone in India, someone, all over the world to do that job that traditionally you wanted someone to be within a 30-minute commute of your office. And so now employing people globally has become more norm because we can work like this through remote work. And we've proven the remote work business model. The issue is because a lot of new entrants have come into the market and a lot of technology entrants have come in with platform type models, they see employment laws as friction. And in tech bro terms, friction means let's just ignore them and simplify the user experience. And maybe we'll get caught, maybe we won't. The end employers need to know that in the terms of service that they just clicked a button, they are deemed responsible for the liability. And that's where it's really important to read the terms of service of these platforms and understand that often they're circumventing laws that will put them at risk. And so, this kind of idea of the licensing to doing the proper remittances, the other friction is just pricing. So price certainty, often I've heard that in the world where they want to just deem everybody independent contractors so that they don't have to worry with what we talked about earlier on about that markup that amortizes severance pay and vacation and other taxes within it. But they're not even, and we can go into work independent contractor and misclassification issues. That's a whole other story. I should have worn my independently t-shirt, but you got to be aware of this and you got to ask the right questions. And the other thing to demystify is the channel partnership model that is often deployed in global employment as well. We talked about this offline, but you've been in situations where you're the in-country expert, and then you're dealing with a partner was dealing with a partner who's dealing with a partner. And it becomes very confusing and potentially even illegal when you aren't cutting through some of those channels and having a more direct employment relationship between the client, the worker, and one middleman that is in country. Can you talk to me about some of that stuff that goes on as well that can frustrate customer service, legalities, etc.?
Absolutely, Jeff. That's very interesting topic. So you very often see, especially those big platforms, right? They tell you, we offer employment solutions in 150 plus, 190 plus countries, right? So that is actually possible. Or let me rephrase that. It is possible only using partners, right? In fact, actually, very often end clients don't know that when they engage with this or that platform, very often there might be, as you mentioned, the platform itself, so that company, that you are provider, and behind one or sometimes even two or three subcontractors, sort of, right? So other companies that actually are the local in-country provider. Now, I know this very well. We used to offer solutions via that model. We actually stopped a year ago for two reasons, Jeff. So the first reason is that when you have multiple layers, the customer tend to have not an optimum customer service level. Let's call it this way, right? Because obvious reasons, right? You need to pass the message from A to B to C to D, and then going back the chain. So obviously something gets lost in translation, obviously. And sometimes even, literally.
Language translation is problematic even.
Yeah. But also, so that was the main reason, for example, why we stopped, that model. But also there's another reason, as you say, legality. Because, for example, where labor leasing regulation applies, it says that the lessor, it's called the lessor, right? So the company that is leasing the employee, the user, the company that is actually using the services of the employee, between the two parties, there should be, or there must be actually a direct contract. Okay, so intermediaries are actually not allowed in between. Otherwise, it become, double leasing or triple leasing, right? Which doesn't make any sense, right? And it's actually then it's also legal. So, those are the main reasons why, for example, we stopped doing that model, but unfortunately, it's a practice that is very much still used. And don't get me wrong, Jeff, I do I understand the reason why a provider can use subcontractors, or why a client, we prefer to use one provider, although this provider is actually subcontracting the solution in a few countries. I totally get it, consolidation, of course. However, again, what are the implications of that, or what kind of service are you actually getting from the platform, or actually even worse, what kind of servicing are you offering to your employee? Because let's face it, right? If you want to hire somebody on the other side of the world, that means you must like this person, right? And you want the best out of for this employee. So definitely, the service to the employee also must be taken into consideration.
I've always said the EOR is the ambassador for some of your top talent, right? Yeah. Typically, the talent that you're hiring directly or that's referred by a manager, etc., is the talent that you want to work for your company, and you've identified them directly, and often your top talent because you hadn't got it through the other channels. And so you want your employer of record to be an ambassador and not create confusion. So, it's an interesting scenario, and you're right. The idea of consolidation is important for a lot of employers to make things simple. The key is to understand the rules, because the governments have caught on to this channel partnership and layers upon layers, and the frustration it's caused to the employees, and also the frustration it's caused to them to find out who's responsible for and legislating things, right? And or enforcing legislation. So they will often say, listen, you can only have more of a direct relationship with one employer of record that's in country. And so to deal with those things, just be aware of it. And although you're consolidating through one employer of record, let's call it the large one that is doing 1,000 workers in the US for you, the 10 workers in Italy, the 3 in Lithuania, the one in Germany, you may need to work with your North American provider to work to get direct contracts to make that legal with your local employer of record, even though it's kind of an umbrella relationship. So, just knowing that is important, versus often what we're finding with the platforms and some of the just marketing out there is saying, I want to deal with you. I'm going to own everything, and then I'll just subcontract upon subcontract. And that becomes problematic, and it's actually illegal in some jurisdictions. So, being aware of that, and then having your generalist employer of record facilitate some of these to align with the laws that are evolving is really important. So it's a constantly evolving world, isn't it?
Absolutely, Jeff. Also, I wanted to add something else related to this topic, right? So when you engage with a platform that doesn't have people running the show in each single country, which is actually the majority of the platforms out there today, those providers cannot really tell you and guide you, and show you what you can and cannot do in the country. I just give you this example, right? I think it's a funny one. It's an interesting one, actually. So I was introduced to 2 or 3 onboardings, right? So we got when we were still working for a partner for one of those platforms, and the partner goes, "Oh yeah, I have a client who wants to add another employee in Italy." And I was like, "Okay, what do you mean another employee, right?" Because they had already few employees with another provider, in country provider, right? So I was like, okay, fine, but I need to understand what's going on there, how many employees they have, and so on and so on. Long story short, when we got on the call with the client, they were like, okay, so we have 13 employees in Italy. I was like, okay, that's a high number for a small country like Italy. May I ask you why we have 13 employees? Oh, well, because it doesn't really make sense to establish an entity. And it was like, well, usually, when you reach that threshold, it doesn't make sense. And then, long story short, Jeff, it turned out that to do what they were doing in Italy and to establish an entity, they needed a license. It was a financial company, or a company probably selling credit cards or things like that. So, that is, and obviously I stopped the deal. I stopped. It was like, no, I cannot facilitate that. And that's an important thing about, EUR today, right? Because I do love the UI industry, and I want the UI industry to be out there forever, right? Because it does offer so many benefits to clients all over the world. But if we are then abusing the system, right, we actually destined to make the system fail, because of course the authorities are going to look after this, right? Going to look into this and say, hang on, what are you doing there? Why are you using a UR provider? You're using UR provider because you don't want to establish an entity for one employee. Fair enough. You're actually using an ER provider to bypass the law because you don't want to, get the license.
Cause nexus. So that terminology is nexus. So typically what you're saying was a financial institution or credit card or something like that needed to be licensed to provide that service, but they didn't want to establish a permanent residency or nexus because they would have had to get licensed. So that's why they were using a third party. And eventually that gets found out. It's interesting that to say, though, a lot of the employer of records in the industry today don't understand that. When I talk to them about Nexus, they have blank stares. And so, just it'll get them in trouble to have a blank stare and not understand that at some point in time, once a company has sizable revenues and employee count on an employer of record, that creates a permanent residency or nexus in that jurisdiction where that entity must start abiding by licensing laws, abiding by income tax laws, etc., for that corporation that is doing it. So it's a very interesting topic as well, that we find the employer of record is facilitating some of this activity that is not proper in general. I've also seen issues of fraud happen quite a bit around fraudulent companies utilizing employer of record to actually scam the employer of record out of funds. So they'll set up a fake corporation, send the EOR 10 fake employees, they'll run through 2 or 3 payrolls, the EOR goes to collect the money afterwards, and the money's gone, the company's fake, it's gone, and that scam just happened where $1 million went out the EOR, off of the EOR's money went out the door to the scam. And so there's a lot of difficult situations where the employer of records have to be more aware and think about that quote unquote friction, because laws are made for reasons, and just because they're there, you shouldn't ignore them and call them friction, like they're just like an itch. They're usually there for a reason, right?
Jeff, but let's also look into this, right? So usually, who is the the first point of contact, when you engage with a EUR provider? Is the salesperson, right? And what is the salesperson supposed to do? To sell you the service, right? And if you look at those platforms, Jeff, and just look at them up on LinkedIn, and you see that most of the salespeople there had zero experience, no experience whatsoever in the industry beforehand. I remember I was talking with a founder of one of the main platforms out there, and was back a couple of years ago, and he was very proud of the fact that he just hired a very top salesperson. And when I was asking, oh well, who did you steal it from another ER provider, right? No. He was a super salesperson from Subaru, which has very little to do with the UI industry, right? All I'm saying is that when you actually, as the prospect, right? So the potential employer, potential client that is in contact with an UI provider, and you're talking to somebody that perhaps just out of college, no much experience about labor law, and you ask questions. Obviously, that person wants to sell you the service, right? And they're not going to engage in a in-depth conversation about the legislation in the country. Again, to give you, another example, that is the reason why PO Italy offers multiple solutions. EUR is only part of our solution, because when I get on the phone, myself or somebody from our sales team, getting on the phone with a client, and then we perceive that perhaps EUR is not that solution for them, against our own interest, and talking about revenue, we actually advise them to set up a company, because we can also help them with this, right? Of course, we earn much less because it's less revenue for us, but it's better for them and for us eventually overall, right? So that is why I believe in nowadays in the industry is not offering what the clients are paying for, because they're paying a lot of money, right, for the service, and they're not really getting much out of it.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, and it's complex. So first and foremost, I always say it's a complex industry. There's lots of complexities, and it often needs in-country experts that have been doing it for years and years and years. So just because the new platform uses partners, doesn't mean that's a bad thing. Using partners is okay, but making sure that you're interacting with the partners and not just a system up here, that you are getting that expertise, that counsel, in some cases having a direct relationship contractually with the in-country partner, even though it's facilitated up here, that is legal, is important. I think, it's evolving and will continue to evolve. And I think being more aware as a buyer of these services is very important, to ask the questions around licensing. Are you able to do this type of EOR versus this type of EOR? Because the needs are very different. And then getting a sense of the expertise of your provider, even if it is a platform that uses partners. If most companies don't have 10 people in 100 jurisdictions, most companies have concentrations of where the majority of the workers will be, or a small group of countries. Understand that and really do your research on some of the labor laws and the licensing laws around staffing or employer of record or PEO, and then work with your partners. So it's a fascinating conversation as always, and I'm so happy to re-engage with you, Matteo, and learn the differences, not only on a global employer of record scenarios, but specifically in Italy, which is a fantastic country that I know there's lots of people wanting to come visit this summer.
Absolutely, Jeff. Let's not forget, though, that the idea about Italy is that, la dolce vita, right? So a country where you can, enjoy and relax. But actually, the stats, says that in Italy, the workers actually work the longest hours in Europe. So fun enough, right? So you wouldn't.
So from a productivity standpoint and work ethic, Italy is the place to go.
Indeed, Jeff. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Matteo, for your time. It's been an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the opportunity.